Good morning, class. Professor Pronte here, and today's video is about unions. We're going to talk this morning about workers taking this choice to get together and negotiate as one, collectively, as opposed to negotiating individually with their employers. Before getting to it, let's keep in mind some of the context that we were talking about in the previous video. During the late 1800s, we saw more workers move into cities, more workers working in factories, and as a consequence, workers were encountering dangerous and poor working conditions. And so it's against this backdrop then that workers at higher rates started to form unions and try to negotiate collectively. All right, so for more detail on that, make sure you're seeing the previous video linked here in the module. Today, though, we're going to talk in more detail about how workers are going about organizing. And so the very first question that we should think about is, what is a union? And the simple answer to that is that a union is when workers make this choice to negotiate with management, to negotiate with their employer collectively rather than individually. There are many different configurations and details, different ways that a union can be set up, but that's the connecting thread for all unions, is that workers are deciding to go at it to negotiate, thinking that they're going to come from a more powerful position if they negotiate all together as opposed to on a one-to-one basis. So why do workers decide to do this? The goals are really straightforward. People decide to form a union with the purpose, one, of negotiating better pay for their members. People are trying to get more money for themselves. Secondly, workers are trying to get for themselves better working conditions. Right? That can be safety, it can be more respect, it can be a lot of different things. Third, workers are trying to ensure a fair process when negotiating with management. And so these are sort of the overarching goals of a union. A lot of people think at first look that when workers decide to unionize, it's going to mean the same pay for everyone within the union. And that's not, in fact, the way that unions work. I don't mind sharing with you guys that I am a member of a union here at Valley College. And of course, at Valley College, there are different union members who get different amounts of pay each month. And so it's not that everybody gets the same pay. Instead, it's that everyone is using the same process, right? There's a contract, typically, that sort of sets in place the rules that are in place for worker and management relationships. To stick with my own personal experience here, I've worked at a place before, right? Not at Valley College, at a different place, where upon starting that job, I sat down individually with my dean, and we had a little negotiation about working conditions and pay. And so that was because the faculty at this other place where I was working were not unionized. And so that's one way to go. That happens with quite a lot of labor relationships. There'll just be a negotiation between that individual worker and management. And in contrast, when I started working at Valley College, there was no such negotiation in terms of how much money I'm going to get or anything like that. Instead, there's a contract that spells all of that out. And so these are the two different ways that worker and management relationships can go. Another real-world example that might be useful for understanding just how union and management negotiations work would be to think of a sports league. I know a lot of you guys are Laker fans, right? Basketball players in the NBA have a union and have a union contract that dictates the rules in terms of contracts that a player might agree to with some team, right? So yes, it's true that LeBron is going to get much more in salary than some other player, some bench warmer or something on the Lakers, who's getting much more pay than me. So you see differences in pay, but it's not the case that LeBron is free to just negotiate whatever wage he can get. There are rules in place, right? There's a maximum salary that each player in the NBA can be paid. There's maximum lengths of those contracts. All those things are stipulated and outlined in the union contract. So there you go, a little bit of background on the way that unions work. Next idea that we want to go over then, what are some good examples and different types of unions that have existed throughout U.S. economic history and exist today. I want to direct you guys to that video that I linked here in the module that's talking about a really famous labor union, and that is the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor, that's a term to know. This is one of the biggest unions that we've ever seen in the United States. The Knights of Labor were in their heyday, and they were the most powerful during the 1880s. This union was huge, and they expanded really, really dramatically over the course of the 1880s in that particular decade. There are numbers to support this. At the beginning of the 1880s, in the year 1880, there were 28,000 members of the Knights of Labor. That's a lot. By the end of the decade, they had over 800,000 members in contrast. And so they were really, really huge and therefore had a whole lot of power in terms of negotiating. I mentioned the Knights of Labor because this is a good example of something called an industrial union. There are a couple ways, like I said before, many ways that unions can be configured. The Knights of Labor were an industrial union. And so what that means is that it's a union representing the interests of workers across an entire industry, regardless of the specific type of job that they're doing. To give you a modern example of this, take a grocery store. At any grocery store, you're going to see workers there that do different types of jobs and have different types of skills. There's a butcher, there's a florist, there are managers, there are people working in the warehouse, right? So all of these people have different jobs and different skills, but they're all working in the same firm or that same industry, right? So if it's an industrial union, then all the workers in that industry, regardless of whether they're a butcher or a florist or a cashier or whatever, would be represented by the same union. And so the Knights of Labor represents for us a really clear example of industrial unionship and lots of power as a result. In the previous video, you guys will see that the Knights of Labor organized strikes during the 1880s, where the main thing that they were pushing for, their goals, were an 8-hour workday, which we see today, kind of cool, and limiting the use of child labor, which is another thing that we don't see today and is a good thing. And so they were successful in that regard. The Knights of Labor are not around anymore, though. The Knights of Labor were so large, and there were some other funny things that they were doing, that they fell out of favor. And a second major national union has surpassed them. And so this other big union that you guys should know is called the American Federation of Labor. The American Federation of Labor, AFL. And the American Federation of Labor started there in the late 1800s, and they're still around today. That's kind of cool. The American Federation of Labor made greater use of a different type of union called craft unions. A craft union. Something else to know. Craft unions are different than industrial unions in that a craft union is going to represent workers of a singular occupation. To get back to the grocery store example that I was talking about just a moment ago, right? In a given grocery store, there's going to be lots of different workers there with different jobs. A craft union would be the union of butchers, say, or union of florists, or whatever it is at that grocery store. In an airline, for instance, craft union might be the union representing the interests of pilots, but not necessarily looking out for the interests of say flight attendants or people working in logistics associated with airlines and so on. So the craft union is representing interests of just one particular type of job. And the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, was a better representation of a series of craft unions. All right. Moving on then. Another goal then that I want to talk to you guys about here today, point that I want to make, is that we've seen dramatic differences in terms of labor law and what's allowed and what's not with regard to unions over time and across different states within the United States. There's not one set of rules that have governed union relationships. It's changed a whole bunch. One of the big issues is in whether or not union membership can be required of people. One configuration that we've seen at different points is that firms sometimes organize themselves, or the workers at a firm organize themselves as something called a union shop. A union shop. And what that means is that if a person goes to work at some union shop, some company that has a contract that's undertaken this provision, the workers have to join that union. They have to pay dues associated with them. And so, yeah, I don't know if this is a right or a wrong thing, but that's the way that some states and some businesses have been organized. Other states have taken another approach. It would be called an open shop. And under an open shop, that practice of requiring workers to join that union, even if they don't want to, is banned or prohibited. And so there's been big differences across states and differences across time with respect to the legality of this particular practice. I'm a little bit torn on this issue, so getting into personal views here, I should acknowledge that. On the one hand, it seems to me like a bit of an overreach to say that a person would be required to join a union if they didn't want to. That seems wrong at first look to me. So in that sense, my personal view is that there's something to open shop sets of rules. But on the other hand, when you look at those states that have union shop laws in place, workers are paid better. And so that's sort of something to reconcile when analyzing the fairness and whether or not union shop laws are just in your opinion. Final thing then that I want to cover here and touch on in this particular video is the impact of unions. Right? What happens in those areas? What happens in those firms where you see union participation occurring? And straight away we can say that pay and working conditions improve. Unions have the goal of getting better pay for their workers, and they succeed. Analysts have gone out there and tried to put a number on this and estimate how much better off workers are in terms of pay if they form a union as opposed to not forming a union. And they call this the union premium. It's estimated that the union premium is somewhere around 10 to 20%, depending upon your specific example. Meaning that if you were to compare, just say, like a police department, two police departments in neighboring cities, and one of them decides to enact a union, to form a union for themselves, and the other does not, on average, that police department, those officers in that police department that have formed the union are typically paid 10 to 20% more than police officers or workers in the other firm. All right, and so is that good? Yeah, from the perspective of a worker, definitely. I'm a worker. I belong to a union, and so I'm pleased about that. In analyzing, though, the effectiveness and the impact of a union on society, we want to remember that there are no free lunches, right? If you are paying workers more, that's coming from somewhere. And so that, I think a good way to think of the impact of a union is that it's moving resources around, moving resources from management to labor to greater extent. And yeah, I'll leave it to you guys to decide if you think that that is the right thing or the wrong thing. An interesting point is that in the United States, union participation, right, the share of workers that are covered by unions is declining. Today, as I film this here right now, it's somewhere between 10 to 13% is what we see for union participation rates. So not too much. It was much higher in recent history. If you look to union participation rates in the U.S., say in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, it was dramatically higher. It's also true that while in the United States we see union participation rates 10 to 15%, somewhere in that window, in many of the other developed countries across the planet, union participation rates are much, much higher. And so that's an interesting thing to point out too, and to try to draw connections about differences in union participation rate and see how they connect to other differences that you see in terms of worker pay or quality of life and so on. Okay, that's all for this one, guys. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.